What's up, guys? How's it going? Thanks for joining me this evening for another live video where I'm going to put together a piece of artwork and try to answer some questions at the same time. I'm going to do something a little bit different in this one, and I'll get into what's going to be a little bit different about this one as I jump into it. Yeah, so in any case, here's the drawing that I posted earlier. And unlike the last one where I had the sketch and then I did an underlay, on this one I actually went ahead and did an ink outline of this one kind of early on. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about breaking and bending the rules in terms of artwork, and this I thought would be a really great way to get into that. Since normally when I'm doing a piece like this, I'm almost always telling people don't outline everything in black, but there's a reason for that. It can impact the style of artwork a lot, but that can also be a benefit. When we're talking about how to identify your style or make changes to style, you do want to experiment. You want to play with ideas. So for this example, I thought, let's change around all the normal things that I would do, or sort of, and we're going to ultimately end up with a different piece of artwork that's different than the normal stuff to some degree, just because we're starting from a different point. So, without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it. I've got markers and paints already mixed up off screen. I'm going to be using the same materials and technique that I normally use, but because we started with kind of a heavier outline, it's going to already take on a different look. And I've got the computer screen right in view here, so if anybody has any questions while I'm working, I'm happy to try and answer. Otherwise, I'm just going to jump right into it. Now, as I mentioned, I've already done a bit of heavy black outlining, which is a little bit unusual for me. I also went ahead and did some of the hardest contrast shadows. And when I was doing this sketch and doing the outlines, I was kind of imagining how I've done some of my coloring book sketches in the past. Just kind of laying out the artwork in a way that now we're really just focusing on the rendering portion, rather than later coming in and cutting those things out. That's a little bit contrary to how I normally work, but I thought if we do it, we'll see what kind of end result we get. It's bound to be different because it's different. Alright, so got markers picked out already. The other thing that I'm going to do different is I'm actually going to use alcohol markers instead of chart pack markers, which are solvent markers, which is also quite different than what I normally do. So I'm going to jump right into it. You know, one of the reasons I actually really like alcohol markers is they are very vibrant. So they have a lot more color punch when you're putting down color. But one of the things that makes me a little bit apprehensive about using them is generally the tip sizes are a little bit smaller. So you don't have as much, it'd be harder to fill a large area, and I like to do renderings as big as I can. And that certainly can get really challenging if you have these limited sizes to work with. There's some exceptions, but generally they all kind of have this sort of narrow chisel tape to them. Even though I'm using a slightly different type of marker, I'm still going to kind of do everything the way that I normally would. But from this point of view, we're a little bit more focused on, let's say, coloring in at this point than building shapes. We already have all the hard shapes. We already know exactly what everything's going to be. So from here, we're just kind of putting the tones in. Now, normally I wouldn't be so in a hurry to run over all these lines while I'm rendering, because they can end up being blurry or otherwise, because the ink is going to run over it and pick up a little bit of that tone and blend it in. But while I was doing some tests the other day, I realized that's not really that big a problem if you're letting the inks dry. So as long as we're being deliberate and patient, it's really not that big a deal, which I wouldn't have thought going into it. I would have for sure thought putting ink over top of ink, you're going to reactivate some of it at least, and there's some truth to it for sure, but not as much as I thought. So what I'm doing right now is going back and forth between this orange and this brown that I'm using to try to soften that edge a little bit. I'm going to come back in with some airbrush later. But for now, back and forth until I kind of get the area to look the way that I want. Alright. I'm kind of after a rich brown into an orange for color, at least on the lower portion. And I have a feel like something like this is actually going to go pretty quick, just because there's already, the outlines being already done actually saves a ton of work. And like I said, normally I would think that having all these outlines in place would hinder the ability to create something clean in the end, but half the legwork is already done. And we're only a couple steps in. So next I'm going to hit the two-tone color, which is going to be back in this fin area here and the roof. And switch over to some Prismas. And just like with the other markers I use, I want to be quick, deliberate, and careful at the same time. And because these markers dry a little bit faster, they're going to be a little bit more prone to streaking, but I'm trying to be careful while I'm working to kind of take that into account while I'm working. I can almost get away with no airbrushing on something like this just because there's very little open area left to work in, but that can actually end up being a benefit later anyways. So while that area is still wet, I'm going to go ahead and just get a little bit more contrast in there. And let's see, I'm going to come back in a little bit more to blend this area in. And I'll probably hit that with a little bit with an airbrush later anyways, just to kind of bring the contrast around a little bit. Alright, so those areas good. I'm going to start working on the other trim and the wheels. Actually, real quick while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead. I left some of these areas down low open on purpose because I knew I didn't want them to be solid black like everything else. But I also know that I don't necessarily want them to be open and gray, even though we're after something that's a little bit more illustrative and stylish. Still have to take into account some rules. And actually, since we're already there with this color, juggling markers over here, let's go ahead and put the bottoms in so that it matches the ground color. That way the reflection feels a little bit more at home. And let's see, actually, that looks pretty good. I don't have anything else left to do in there. And let's see, it's going to stay with the same range of markers. Still, we're just working in Prisma grays. And I'll go ahead and just start to put in a little bit of the wheel tone. I don't want to get too carried away just yet, because there's parts of this that I'm still sorting out as I go. But one thing I do like about alcohol markers is because they're fast and they dry faster, they can be a little bit more precise compared to the other markers that I use. Alright. Okay, so we actually have so much legwork done already because the outline was done already. And obviously, it has a really specific looking style because of the way that the outlines are, but it certainly has helped to kind of get the coloring stage a lot simpler. I'm just kind of hitting some of the uppers with this kind of powdery purpley blue so I can have kind of a reflective look. I'm going to mix to get a little bit of chrome, a little bit of a polish look. A lot of this will come up in the details, but not as much as normally would, or will have to, because of the line work actually, which is kind of cool. Alright, let's see. Almost any other time I wouldn't be using alcohol markers over top of all my pen work for fear of everything smudging and running, but I actually did this outline a couple of days ago, so I was curious what would happen if I let it dry, and it actually seems to have helped quite a lot. But I also like the look of alcohol marker smearing a little bit of Bic pen. It has a little bit of personality to it. Alright, so now that we've got some blue, a little bit of blue in there. Whoop. Just pulled the marker in half accidentally. Yep, probably time to throw that one away then. Alright, cool. So the next thing is I'll grab a little bit of gray to get into this window area here. And to some degree, I'm relying on the ability to bring a little bit of this black ink into that area. So I already have a bit of a different look than what would otherwise be anyways. But that's kind of the point of breaking the rules and bending them sometimes, just to see if we can end up with something different. And I think we're definitely going to end up with something different. All right, kind of going back and forth with some Prisma grays. With these type of markers, especially on a marker paper like this, there's a lot more space to kind of go back and forth and blend areas or pick up paint from another area. Which is kind of cool. All right, let's see. Get these tail lights in here. Try a different red. I don't use alcohol markers often, so by the time I need to grab them, they're not always still alive. Alright, so I'm going to grab another tone of gray here. And see if I can put a little bit of detail into the wheels. At this point I have to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more deliberate. Just because as we're starting to build contrast, a whole lot more is going to show, so I want to make the least amount of mistakes at this point, if possible. It's kind of cool that so much shape is coming up really, really quick. Robin Matthew, which markers do you use over Bics such that they don't bleed or blend, is I assume what you're saying. Actually, I'm going over the Bic. There's Bic here. Obviously, the entire sketch is Bic. And then I went over it with a little bit of black marker. So you can see even the alcohol markers that I'm using, because these are just general alcohol markers. These are wicked, but they're the same as like Prismacolors. They are going to activate Bic a little bit, and you can see that. But because I didn't get really heavy-handed with the sketch, it's not killing it. But if I was, like in general, when I'm rendering, in order to keep that from happening, I would use chart pack markers. You can grab one, for example, one of these guys, because they have a different chemical makeup, so they don't interact with Bic pen. but there's trade-offs all the time. So there's a lot of really cool things about using alcohol markers versus solvent markers, or what would be considered xylene markers, I guess. So as with anything, you gotta figure out what the trade-offs, you know, if they're appropriate for what you're doing. Because in the case of this, for example, definitely the alcohol markers are way more vibrant, which is fantastic. You end up with this really bright, saturated piece. Alright, so where was I? Detailing the wheels just a little bit. I probably won't end up with near as much detail work because, again, because everything's outlined, there's so much legwork that's done that wouldn't otherwise be. But I think it's important to kind of break your own rules sometimes and just be a little bit more comfortable thinking outside the box. Because if you do the same stuff all the time, then you know your results are sort of predictable, and that is definitely making it sound like a bad thing, and it's actually a good thing, but it might also get a little boring after a while too. Alright, so next thing we want to do is, let's see, is there anything marker-wise left to do before we switch over into some airbrush? I think we might be ready for some airbrush. I'm going to set all my markers aside. Interesting in this kind of quick format that all the color and tone is done. If I really needed to do something quick, this could be considered done to some degree, minus a handful of the details. But I'm going to push it a little bit harder, just especially since it went kind of quick. Alright, just noticed something I wanted to tweak here. Cool. Alright, so now I'm going to switch over to the airbrush and just start to blend some of these colors just a little bit more than they are. I already have a bunch of pre-mixed colors, so hopefully I won't have to spend too much time going back and forth here. Alright. Normally when I'm airbrushing over ink, this is the part that gets way more saturated, but because I was using alcohol markers, the saturation is already super high, so I'm just kind of adding to it a little bit. Another thing I'm noticing is also because I went really wet with the markers, there's a little bit of warp where I was blending some of the colors together, which is sort of normal given the circumstances, but definitely something to remember going forward. Alrighty. That is all the orange I actually need. So I'm going to swap out for the next tone. So excuse me a sec while I clean out the airbrush. See, I've got a brown mixed up. We'll go ahead and put that in. Alright. So I'm also airbrushing with acrylics, which are water-based. So be careful not to overdo it and warp the page here, which on marker paper can happen pretty darn easily. Alright, I'm going to switch over to the next color. Let's see what we next. So we need just a little bit of black. So technique-wise, I'm generally doing the exact same things that I normally would. So don't necessarily want to trivialize the process that I'm familiar with, but because we skipped a few steps with a more firm outline, we're already way closer to our destination than normal at this, at 20 minutes in. So right now I'm just putting a little bit of shadow over the wheel. Just to create a little bit of depth. And I'll take a little bit of that black and come into the core color just a little bit. I don't want to overdo it, but just enough to suggest the color shift that's happening. And then while I got the color out, I can kind of blend a little bit of these lower areas as well, since I've just got a really transparent black. I don't want to get carried away, but I can use it to clean up a lot of what's happening and maybe do a little underglow here. And I'm even using a different airbrush paint than I normally would. Again, just to kind of switch gears a little bit, just to feel like I'm genuinely trying a bunch of different stuff. I always have a ton of different materials that I use and that I like and that I keep on hand. But every now and then, I'll just break out some stuff that I used to use a while ago, or forgot how it works, or something like that, just to refamiliarize myself with it, and to give it a chance to be the thing that I use again. Because you never know. Sometimes you forget how good certain materials are, and then you go back to it a little while later, and you're like, man, why did I stop using this stuff? Alright, so we've already taken a whole lot of that marker work and softened it up, which is good because it was looking a little bit rigid and a little bit stiff, but it's already shaping up pretty good here. Or at least, coming from the style that it was into what it is. And actually, since my airbrush is in pretty decent shape for once, go ahead and do a little bit of the wheel detail with the airbrush. I'm just kind of kicking the values down in a few places. I could have done it with the marker just the same, but I'm here already, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. Alrighty. Let me get this guy just a little bit. The next thing to do will be to grab some blue. So I'm going to clean out the airbrush one more time. This definitely feels more like a quicker rendering than some of the other examples I've done as demos before, since we're like 80% done already. A lot more of the details will balance things out. But it also, as I keep saying, has a different look. So eventually lines and details, especially in cars, come out as part of the detail. But normally I try to save that stuff for the end. So doing a lot of those details up front is kind of interesting to see how much it changes the process. Alright, now we get some blue. So we can start to create a little bit of color cast in our upper surfaces. Like the glass and the chrome. And at this point I don't mind oversaturating just a little bit, because to some degree we're almost competing with this really, really bright orange. So I might as well push hard. I'm going to have a little bit of blue up here, but not a lot, because this is more like an off-white. They don't normally have a whole lot of color cast to it, or the color rather. So a little bit, but not too much. And kind of like with any other illustration, I'm not doing any of the masking. I'm just kind of letting everything work. The outlines are so strong that they kind of block out all the areas pretty naturally anyways. So it doesn't even... It's far less consequence to doing it this way than there would be even normally. I want to make sure that all the blue is a bit balanced so that all the chrome and upper surfaces have like a very similar read to them. Nice, like that little extra blue glow there kind of has a really cool effect. Not realistic, I wouldn't say, but really cool. Kind of gives it a cool glow. And at this stage I can start to think about how or what I might do as a background while I'm thinking about the details of the next stage as well. So that's actually the last color that I need to airbrush. Go ahead and pour that out. For once my airbrush is actually not trying to kill me and fight me too much, which is really, really cool. It turns out when your tools are in good working order, it makes your life a whole lot easier. I'm just going to clean out the airbrush, just run a little bit of cleaner through it. Excuse me for a second. And I'll actually end up coming back to that later anyways. But let's see where we're at with this guy. So now I'm going to grab an eraser, just like I would in any of my other illustrations, and maybe pull a little bit of the airbrushing out. Not a ton, but a little bit. Markers rolling across my table here. And I did a whole lot more with marker than I normally would on something like this. And I'm not sure if it's because of the way that the heavy outlines were or not. But I dig the look. It definitely has a little bit more cartoony animation punch to it. But visually it's also just a little bolder. It's a little stronger. I dig it. What I'm doing here is subtractive highlighting. I'm actually taking an eraser and pulling some of the paint out. Even broke some of the rules of how color works. But that's alright. I'll get into that some other time. Alright, so with where we're at, actually the next thing to do, we need to break out some pencil and do some detail that way. Let's see, there's actually not a ton of pencil detail to do in this one, but I'm going to do a little bit. So let's grab my tester sheet here. I always keep extra paper on hand so I can test the airbrush and markers, but I'll throw some sandpaper down and whatever pencil I'm going to use for these little details, and I tend to sharpen with mostly sandpaper so that I'm not just sharpening all the time. Otherwise, I would just be sharpening all the time. And there isn't going to be a ton of detail here, but I do know for sure that I want to do these jams at least partially in pencil, because I don't want to paint them all the way in, because that line will be a little too harsh. And let's see, grab a ruler real quick. And as we get into the details, they need to be a little bit more deliberate and a little bit more accurate. So that's when I'll start pulling out some of the rulers or ellipses or curves or otherwise. And start to put the reflection in the glass, both parts of it. Clean up a couple things here and there. And there's a couple of areas where marker went just into like the trim area, a little bit heavy. But I'm going to get into that with paint. So I don't want to spend too much time on pencil, because this one's going so fast. Now I'm just thinking, what's the most efficient way to kind of keep everything going? Because at a certain point the style that you're doing. If you just start to slow down all of a sudden and hover on some details, it can start to look a little disjointed and like you changed your mind partway through the process. So now that I know that this is going pretty quick, I want to make sure that I'm making decisions that kind of keep it going quick. Yeah, I usually work pretty fast anyways, but this is going kind of extra fast, which is neat, but again, kind of has its own look for sure. Alright, just kind of hitting those door edges. And of course, the perspective that I drew in, something I really didn't hit on earlier. Damn, what pencil is that? If we're talking about this pencil here, this would be a what's left of a Faber-Castell Poloychromo white. I prefer these to, what's the other one I use? Sorry, I'll look through Prismacolor. I also use Prismacolor pencils for details, but I prefer these. They just have a bit more potency to the color, if that makes any sense. So they're also really vibrant, and the way that I like to do details in the end is with acrylics. And because these are a dissimilar material, the acrylics go over them really nicely. If I use, say, Prismacolors, for example, they're paraffin. They have a bit of wax to them. So water tends to resist them. So therefore, highlighting over top of wax with a water-based material is a little tricky. But I always use such a huge variety of stuff or materials in the artwork that I do. But I'm always aware of what is going to get along with what, and sometimes I'm surprised. I learn a lesson or learn something new that I can take to the next thing. But that's really anything, I guess. I'm almost noodling at this point. There's so much that I can just do in paint detail and more or less be done. Because I'm actually done with all the pencil work that I would do, because everything was reasonably structured in this one. I also drew this in a really peculiar perspective. That's what I was just about to say, is that I drew this in kind of a low, forced perspective. Another thing that's a bit of a rule bend, but sometimes we're just after something that visually looks cool versus something that's so realistic. If everything is perfect and realistic and believable, it's a little unremarkable to me. There's some really cool things about the ability to just recreate photorealism very, very nicely. But at a certain point, I think, especially with something like cars, you could force the perspective a little bit harder. You can oversaturate the colors. You can push the fundamentals a little bit to make something that has a bit more appeal to it. It just looks cooler sitting there, I think, even though the perspective is way forced and way bent, and the colors, at least from here, are really, really saturated. But we're coming up a way to create extra impact. Alright, so switching gears a little bit here. The other thing that I was thinking about when I was looking at this, especially on the screen, is should I just leave this as a solid white background, or should I do like some type of shape that kind of offsets it? And I'm still making up my mind a little bit. Thank you very much, King Custom Garage, and hello. So sometimes it's nice to kind of have this really clean background because it just looks clean. But, well, it looks a certain way on the screen while I'm looking at it. On my paper, I just have a car sitting at an angle. So something I might do to kind of combat that a little bit, and for the sake of demo, might as well just go ahead and do it. Just gonna sketch in some lines here that I can use to freehand in a couple of bars of color. But I'm going to switch markers. I'm still using alcohol markers, but I'm actually switching between Wicked's, Prisma's, Copic's. They're all alcohol markers. So, you know, some parts of it don't really make any difference because they're all pretty similar materials. I have to turn my head a little bit strange to do this because the camera is like right there. It's like maybe a foot off of the drawing, which is making this kind of unusual. actually, I'm going to bump the value of that a little bit to create a little bit of contrast, which I can do while it's wet, and it'll melt in a little bit more. And that way I've just kind of created a slightly, just changed the dynamic of the illustration a little bit. I refer to this as kind of a picture-in-picture look. We have a frame here, but the car is sitting outside of it, so we get a little bit of depth and a little bit of perspective just by adding a little extra shape to it. I'll move this up a little bit so that it's in frame. Alright, from there, we're going to jump straight into paint details. Because some of the final outlines and details are actually where things are going to pop anyways, so we're just going to get into it. Whoops. Man, butterfingers today. I'll try not to drop anything on this artwork. When I'm doing these videos, the artwork is flat on a desk, so pretty much anything can go wrong all the time, but that's artwork for you. I love the forced perspective. Do you have a tutorial for forced perspective? From Robin Matthew. I don't, but it's something I want to cover specifically, and I think is also going to be very difficult to cover, because the way that I do it, and I wasn't taught how to do it, so I probably break a lot of rules in the process. Because you have to have a good sense of the fundamentals of perspective in order to know how to break the rules of perspective. True with a lot of things. But I would really, really like to cover that, and it might be in several different parts in order to get it right, or it'll end up being an hour or two of just drawing a few different versions of something to try to get the point across. But I think that will be a really cool thing to cover. Because in my search for information about her, I never really found very much. So it'd be cool to share a little bit of that, or at least a little bit of insight into the process of how I think about how I'm going to change the perspective. So I've got a little bit of white paint here, and the first thing I'm going to do is go over my trim area. And again, because my very first step was outlining everything, I'm basically just making sure that the paint stays within the lines that I've already put down. At this point, if I'm a little bit slower and a little bit more patient, then I won't have to fix any of the mistakes. I won't have to outline it again, I guess is what I'm saying. Because the outline's already there, I can use that as my guide for making sure that I don't put in too much or too little. But otherwise, we're jamming right through this thing. So the first thing I normally start with is the major, like the long lines, because those details are a little bit more sensitive, I think. And of course, waiting to the very end to do the big highlights and the hot spots. I'm trying not to hit my face on the camera. I'm like being really cautious of how I get these lines in here. I don't even know until I look at the computer screen if I've got it right. Looking forward to it, much appreciated. Yeah, absolutely. I am looking forward to it as well. I'm actually really enjoying doing these videos. A lot of this stuff is work that I'm doing during the day anyways, or morning warm-ups. Already stuff that I'm going to do anyways. So just lately getting in the habit of recording a bit more of everything to share it has been a lot of fun. Alright, just finishing up some of the long line stuff here before we switch over to the tiny details. This is sort of a smallish, medium-sized illustration, so I have to also be careful not to put my hands in wet paint. Working on paper is a little bit more forgiving, because the surface is absorbing paint at the same time. So it's a benefit and a curse, because it's going to dry really fast. But in the case of long lines and details, it could be too fast at the same time. Oops, sorry. I'm bumping the camera here. Just kind of carefully outlining some of these areas so they feel a little bit more split up from each other. And if I'm using white paint over or around the black lines that I have, I can also vary the line width of the black lines as well, which is kind of cool. Just kind of looking over everything just to make sure everything's good and balanced. To come back in with a little bit of pen to re-hit those. Go ahead and get the door handle here. And while we're over here, I'll go ahead paint's just a teeny bit wet. A lot of details like this I wait to paint in anyways, just because I want them to be a little bit more accurate. I don't mind a little bit of whimsy in some of the initial stuff, but I do want to make sure the final details are right. Or as right as they can be for what I'm doing, I guess. As I'm working, I'm kind of noticing little pieces and parts where I'm like, I should probably try to clean that up a little bit. Instead of grabbing a marker, I'll just grab a pencil that's close to the same color and value so that it's light and quick work. Definitely kind of has a nice cartoony animation feel to it, which normally would be what I'd be avoiding, but we're in the pursuit of a different end result today, and I think we're successfully getting it. There's a few areas I'm waiting to do until I'm doing the final detail highlights, because I'm going to use a different size brush, so I'm trying to be a little bit constrained about just trying to paint everything in while I've got a brush in my hand, because I want to change brushes so I can get the right size details in the right place. But now we can actually, real quick, go ahead and get this in. This one, and this one. Nice. Cruising right along. Cool. Alright, so back to the wheels, or now to the wheels. Whatever, something wheels. Alright. I'm going to go a little bit slower with the paint details, especially around these ellipses, because I'm going to freehand them. And because I've got outlines, all I have to do is be careful to land in between the outlines at this stage, because I took so much time up front to make sure that those things were good. The only thing I have to do now is kind of color in between the lines. It's a bit more like one of my coloring book sketches, which is part of what prompted the idea of doing this, because I had done a demo before, a couple years ago probably, where I used one of my early coloring book sketches as a demo, and man, it went quick. Kind of like this one, and this one is way more dynamic, just because of the things that I've learned since then. What's everybody else doing on this Sunday night? It's Sunday, I'm pretty sure. Makes for a sunset and palm trees background. You're not wrong. I think the colors really sell that idea too. It feels very, very like California or Florida. It just has that look to it. And that would be going a little far out for even what I would do on something experimental. Palm trees, maybe. I don't mind the idea of palm trees. I might change my mind and go okay with the palm trees. We'll see. We got plenty of time. So contrary to some of the other videos I've done where I'm like, definitely don't outline everything, I'm pretty much outlining everything. Again, kind of in the pursuit of a different end result. And there'll be parts of this that I'm like, yeah, that was a really cool decision, or otherwise, and there'll be parts that I go, man, I'll probably never do that again. But that's okay. Sometimes you want to change things up and just see what happens. Can you show all of your car and truck drawings, please? Man, that would be really tough to do in a video. I could try. I could probably go through one folder, maybe, of drawings, because I have a lot. It's what I do for a living, so I have tons and tons of artwork, either that I've done or that's here. But I always think that videos like that would be kind of boring because it's just me showing old artwork, but if it's something that people are interested in, I certainly can. Just kind of being slow and deliberate about some of these details, because here's where things matter. Kind of the body shape of cars is a little bit general. The way reflections work is kind of generalized as well. But the details and the trim and the wheels can be a little bit more make or break. Because you wouldn't want to do them wrong. Alright, and that's actually probably pretty good for that one. And now I can just more or less use that as a reference for how I think I want to tackle the details on the rear wheel. And keep on keeping on. Like on the fence about adding palm trees. I'm not sure yet, man. I could do it. I could totally do it. You know, I'd love to have some music playing in the background. This is like, probably to me, it's got to be the most boring part to watch. Just paint drying. No noise, nothing happening. There's really not a lot for me to say at the detail stage. Just kind of painting in things where I think they should go. Highlighting what I think needs a little bit more detail. And normally I would put a little bit more, or I'd have music on when I'm working, that's for sure, but YouTube is a little strict on stuff like that, so I prefer not to risk it. There really won't be too many details. Getting into the wheels here is probably the heaviest amount of detail. Everything else is kind of simple comparatively. But as I say, wheel is one of those really important details, so don't want to overlook it. And I actually would rather over detail the wheels than any other part of the car. Just kind of looking back and forth between contrast and line weights. Because it's a different style, and being cautious of details in a slightly different way than I normally would be, which is good. When you're doing work in a different way than you normally would, it will also help you think about solutions to problems you're not normally solving. So it's kind of cool. Helps you think outside the box a little bit. Because of the style, I can be a little bit more heavy on line weights to show depth instead of value changes. Cool. All right. Amazing, great skills. Thumbs up. Thank you very much, Roberto. All right. So let's see. We've got pretty much all the details painted in, and just kind of cleaning up some of these color blocks. And then some of these guys get painted in a little bit better. Some freehand details at the end, I think, just have a little bit of soul to them, so I just go on for it. Alright, so I'm looking at it going, okay, there's a couple of details that I would do slightly differently. Because I'm still at this stage, I can still do them differently. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little tire tread in it. Not much, just like a corner tread to indicate the difference between the tires and the fender wells. They're already solid, same color when I started, but at this stage it'll be a nice detail to kind of split the areas up. Because the illustration's sort of simplified, which is nice, but sometimes too simplified can feel like it lacks detail. Alright. Switch over to a teeny tiny Prismacolor real quick. It's alright. Digging through pencils, trying to find the one true pencil. Oh, I shake the table. Cool. I like it. Just kind of brushing off a little bit of the dust and the dirt. And try to not run my hands over everything as much as possible. So I'm not just picking up more stuff and redispersing it. That's why I like to keep the brush nearby. Alright. So I've got a pen in my hand. I'll go ahead and hit some of these details just a teeny tiny bit. Yes. Alright, cool. Alright, well then I got a couple other long paint line details to fit in, and then we'll jump into main highlights, and that'll be that. I'm jamming pretty quick on this one. come up with like a secondary line just to kind of busy it up a little bit. Just so it has a little bit more motion and a little bit more flow. And while I'm there, I can just go ahead and actually grab the same marker I used to do the outlines, which is actually just a brush tip, and really carefully cut these edges back in. And at this stage especially, it's important to use the same types of tools. Otherwise, it can change the look of the artwork. If I was to start to use microns right now, it would really change the look. And I know that because I've done it and went, whoops, I should have just stayed simple. But it can be really easy to see, to feel like it can look better if I just do this or I just do this. Eventually you have to kind of balance the appeal that you're after. And actually, real quick, I'm going to do a nice heavy outline around the outside here. Even though I've got some of that really cool blue glow that I like, it'll still be there, but I'm going to cover up some of the line weight with the paint. Nice. All right, jamming right along here. Okay. Let's see what else. I'm starting to noodle a little bit. I can tell that I'm getting close to done because I'm running out of things to do, except for, you know, the major highlights and otherwise. So I'm gonna switch. Actually, real quick, while I'm here, go ahead and get the little bit of detail into there. Needs a little bit more outline. There we go. Maybe hit these tire details just barely, if I can. Alright, I'll switch over paintbrushes. So I can do some of these major highlights and wrap this guy up. See? Sorry, at this point I'm like, oh wait, I see a detail I need to change. Got one of these lines that is slightly out of whack. It's from the way that I outlined it, but it's fixable, so I'm going to go ahead and fix it. It's at least better. Cool. Alright, so I'm going to tighten a couple of things up while I'm here. Now grab a bigger paintbrush to do some of these fatter highlights. Grab a little bit more paint. Get on with it. I'm just going back and forth, mixing a little bit of the acrylic with water until I kind of get the feel that I'm after in the brush. There's a little bit of a drag and a weight that I'm after. And I'll fine tune a little bit as I'm doing details, but after having done it 10,000 times, I at least have an idea of the ballpark that I'm after. And oftentimes these are the kind of highlights that give the shine a little bit more pop, a little bit more feeling of gloss. Sometimes that can be more obvious in earlier stages. Something reading glossy or satin has a lot to do with the way the color contour works, as well as the highlights or lack of highlights. But that's probably an entire another video that could be done just on understanding color contour. So I want these highlights to be big and legible, but also deliberate. You very much don't want to be putting them in the wrong places, because it can make the shine or the reflection of something less legible. There, I'm just kind of taking a wet paintbrush and moving the paint around a little bit more to soften the edge of something or carry the paint over a little bit further than I was planning to. Alright, so from here, let's see. Need a lot more paint for the big wheel highlights. Everything's pretty well detailed, so I don't want to add just a whole bunch of big blobs of white. Cool. All right. Cool. Alright, so move on to, let's see, what would be the rear. I kind of like to arc the way that light goes so that it follows a certain path that helps things be readable but also extra interesting. So almost done here, actually. If I can keep myself from jumping around too much. And certainly there's a lot of upfront time saved by picking markers and colors ahead of time that may or may not seem obvious, but because I spend some time mixing colors or testing markers before I do an illustration, I save a lot of time in the artwork phase of not trying to imagine what something is going to look a certain way, or if I've got the right set of colors picked out for the thing that I'm doing. I've already tested everything, I've already got everything picked out, and it saves a ton of time. But that should seem sort of obvious. Alright, almost there. Just a couple major highlights off of the back. Actually, sorry. There's a few different things I would do differently with the grays on the next one if I were going to use this type of style a little bit more often. But all part of the learning process, for sure. Alright, just a handful of highlights off the back. Let's see here. Not much left. Sorry, just gonna noodle in some details real quick. I'm getting a little obsessive over something I'm trying to do very, very quickly. Alright, we're an hour and 7 in. It's actually pretty good. Hey Shanna, how's it going? Just about done here. Almost. No, that's right. It's a detail I missed off the front here. So I'm gonna go ahead and get real quick. Alrighty, actually, that's pretty much it. Strangely enough, that went super quick. Oh, you know what, real quick, before I put away the paintbrushes, do a little bit on the glass real quick. I have you on my phone and TV. Very cool. Nice. Well, I really appreciate it. Alrighty. Well, that just about wraps this one up, actually. So, go ahead and do the last little bit here, which is... This probably look cool with a blue signature. Well, thank you guys so much for stopping by on your Sunday evening. I hope the rest of your weekend's good, and I'll see you in the next one.